this working? Is it on? Yes? Okay. Good. Well, it's like Dublin. It's wet and it's cloudy and it's raining, so I feel very much at home here. It's not very different from Ireland. The weather's just perfect for me. I hope you can all understand my English with my Irish accent. Please, if things aren't clear, we have a discussion at the end, but you can also interrupt me and say, excuse me, I don't know what you're talking about, explain some words, and that's fine with me. So please have questions during and after the talk. I started off actually in genetics. That was my first qualification. I was a geneticist, and I always wanted to know how the body, how the genes affected our minds. That was my interest. How do genes affect our minds? And of course, in those days, most genetics, that's going back a long time, I'm quite old, but in those days, they weren't really interested in the question of how genes affect the mind. They were much more interested in really how you can produce more milk from cattle, how you have better crops, how you can, in fact, have better meat on cattle and so forth, especially in Ireland. So I was a bit frustrated. So I decided to study psychology. And because I was a biologist, a geneticist, I specialized in psychophysiology. That is how the mind and the body interact. That was my area. I did a lot of research, and I was particularly interested in how then meditation can affect the body. And what was quite interesting was that you could teach people, you could show by doing some research, you could have two groups, and one group they'd be taught meditation, and one group they would be told, you know, this meditation, it's really, really good. It helps your body to relax. It helps all these questions. And the other group, we'd be told something quite different. Well, we're just trying this out, but we're not very optimistic. We don't think this really has much value. And then we tested them over many weeks and months to look at their blood pressure, their heart rate, how much their skin conductance level, that is how much they're sweating, at their brain waves and their blood pressure. And actually what we found was those people who had been told that meditation was really, really helpful in relaxing, they showed a significant improvement in their ability to relax. Whereas the other group, who were doing exactly the same practice, didn't show that difference. So the idea that this is going to make a difference, a positive difference, already affected the body. That was really interesting, that just the idea that if you do something like meditation and you know it is going to change how your body is going to be in terms of relaxation, that actually makes a difference. The thought makes a difference. Because all they had to do was to repeat a mantra. Both groups were repeating the mantra in the same way, and during and after, we found that the people who believed this to be valuable, who were told it was valuable, had a better response. The other thing was, I also used meditation to induce hypnosis. And I mentioned this here because some people I heard were interested in hypnosis. I worked in the psychosomatic unit. That's the unit where people come when they have medical problems and we can't find a medical solution. No medical solution seems to work. So the doctors, they get very tired, they try medication, they try surgery, and then they say, okay, look, I think this is in your mind. Off you go to the psychosomatic unit. And of course, the people don't like that. For them, it's an insult to be told it's all in your mind, go to the psychosomatic unit. So my job was to, in fact, teach them to relax and also sometimes use hypnosis. In fact, we had a very good system. What we did was we attached a polygraph. Now, you understand what I mean by polygraph. We looked at their muscle tension, their brain waves, their heart rate, their sweating, the skin temperature, and the blood flow. And we would ask them lots of questions. And while asking the questions, we'd ask, tell me about your mother, tell me about your father, tell me about your spouse, your husband, your wife, your children, your work. And they would answer. And I just give one example of a very typical situation, a nurse who came in. She had many what we call cardiovascular problems. She had high blood pressure, she had very cold, bad circulation, Raynaud's disease in her hands. She had many what we call hemodynamic or cardiovascular problems. And in the questionnaire, while being questioned, she would say, everything is fine. I don't know why I'm here. I don't need to see a psychologist like you. I mean, it's a medical problem I have. But when I asked her about her husband and her daughter and things like that, I could see in the polygraph, it was shooting up. I could see that, it's called a lie detector. They're lie detectors, okay? And I could see that, in fact, when I mentioned husband, when I mentioned daughter, things really went off the scale. And I asked afterwards, I said, you know, how did you feel when I asked you about your husband? Oh, I felt fine. And that's why you didn't feel fine. Look at this results. She was absolutely amazed to see that her body was telling me something that her mind was not telling me. Her body was telling me something that her mind could not tell me. And when I began to ask her more questions about her husband and her daughter, I realized there were many, many problems, okay? Many problems, very serious problems, serious illness, things like that. Now, she was somebody we would call a repressor. She was highly defended against being in touch with her own body. Her mind-body were split, okay? And, of course, what the psychotherapy involved was to get her to be able to be in touch with her own body, to feel the tensions, to feel the emotions, and to be able to verbalize them, to put words onto bodily feelings. And, in fact, she did so well that she began to tell all her friends who were also nurses, why don't you go to the psychosomatic unit. So that's an example of just how the kind of work I was doing. The other thing was that we had people whose problems were much deeper, and I would use hypnosis. And in that case, I was trained in hypnosis as well, but I used to use meditation for hypnosis induction. Now that's very strange, you might think. Especially, I would get them to repeat a mantra over and over again, to be very relaxed, to have sensory reduction, sensory deprivation. So all that's happening is closed eyes, relaxation, monotony, a repetition, and eventually they would be, that would stop the intellectual mind, the cognitive mind, the cerebral mind from thinking too much, and I would then bring them back to situations. And in fact, I used that because in the psychosomatic unit we had a lot of problems, psychosexual problems. And for example, we had what we call vaginismus, the difficulty for the vagina to relax. We would have retarded ejaculation, the inability for men to have an orgasm. And with hypnosis, we would be able to bring them right back into the problem areas, and they were able to overcome their problems through a combination of psychotherapy and hypnosis. So this was how the kind of work I was doing for many years in the psychosomatic unit. Okay, so that's where, in fact, I then went on I qualified in psychotherapy, and I developed an interest in mindfulness. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll move on. I want to talk about Carl Jung. You see, I think the mind is terribly important. In fact, as Carl Jung said, not only does the psyche, the mind, exist, but it is existence itself. It is an almost absurd prejudice to suppose that existence can only be physical. We might as well say, on the contrary, that physical existence is a mere inference, since we know of matter only insofar as we perceive psychic images mediated by the senses. In other words, what Carl Jung was saying, in very simple English, is that it's only through our mind that we know about physical reality. Therefore, the mind is really critical in anything we know and do. I want to make a few jokes here, mind and suffering, because this is about the mind and suffering. My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened. Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher. In other words, that in our own minds, we create catastrophes, we create problems, we worry all the time. And a lot of the things we worry about never happen. Some do, of course. I'm not sure if you know Michel de Montaigne. There's another man, I'm afraid these are mostly French references because I do most of my reading in French, okay? But another man called Luc Ferry, he is a French philosopher, he's still alive. He was saying, look, we suffer, and we have two levels of solving the problems. We can change the world, we can change society, that's reformism. We have different political, socio-political systems, or we can go back on ourselves and do the work on ourselves. That's back like the Greek philosophers, the Roman, the Stoics, I suppose, and the Buddhists and the Taoists. They were very much busy with self-fortification, with self-enhancement. So sometimes, you know, political change comes very slowly, and sometimes it never comes in your lifetime. And you cannot wait till the next generation or the generation afterwards. Sometimes you better just do it yourself, okay? So if you're going to wait for a perfect society, then you'll be waiting an awful long time. But, of course, both are important. I'm not saying one is more important than the other, but we have a personal responsibility, and that is the Stoic approach to life. Now, I want to say that I have a lot of slides here because normally this talk, this is a workshop I do, it normally lasts at least 3 or 4 hours. I'm only going to select a small amount of this, so I'm going to skip quite a few slides because I won't have time to go over all of them with you. So if I go quickly through some, don't worry, because I have to select what I'm going to talk about. I just want to go back to the idea of healing, because the word healing in English is we have the expression in English, to be hale and hearty. Hale means to be wholesome, complete. In Old English, it comes from the word to heal, to be a healer, to be healing, to be healthy. They're all the same words. They all mean complete or wholesome. And hearty is to be like happy, to have a happy heart. And we greet people in Old English by saying hail, or in French, salut, which means health to you, health to thee. So the idea that healing, traditional healing, mental healing is about getting back to the wholesomeness, the completeness. There's something missing, something lacking that we have to work on. I'm not sure if people know this man, Kenneth Pelletier. He wrote a book called Mind as Healer, Mind as Slayer. It was quite a big, at the time, 1977, some big impact at the time. The idea that with our minds, we can make ourselves better and we can make ourselves worse. You all have heard of the placebo effect, that if you believe something to be helpful, the kind of pills, the kind of doctor-patient relationship, even before surgery, we know if the surgeon says to the patients, it talks in a much more positive way, hopeful way, optimistic way, this affects the outcome. We know that GPs, the way they talk to their patients, the research has been done again and again, showing that the attitude of the GP has a big impact on the way the patients improve. Of course, and we also know that a noxious boss, a boss who is very dictatorial, can actually increase the likelihood of people having heart disease. This has been shown. These are bits of research which have been done again and again. We also know that recovery from heart disease is greatly helped by having attachments, people, animals, pets. This research has been done too. In fact, it's a very big factor in recovery, is how happily you are connected and attached to loved ones, to animals, to hobbies and interests. So we know that this has a big impact. It is actually so big that it's actually one of the most important impacts. People who are isolated and lonely have a much higher rate of physical and mental disease. This is shown again and again. We are social animals. Now, we also know, of course, that the opposite of the placebo effect is the nocebo effect. That is the harmful, negative effect of being told something negative, being told something unpleasant. So, in fact, I talked to you about, when I tell the people that the mantra is really not any good for you, it might be kind of Eastern sort of Eastern, I don't know, some strange practice that's harmful for Westerners. People actually, sometimes they show this in their bodies. So we know that the mind has a huge effect, for better and for worse. Okay, is that okay to carry on a bit? You're with me, you can understand what I'm not speaking too fast, I hope, are you? No? No? Yes? Okay, I won't talk too much about this because we haven't time to talk about traditional healing in Ireland, but there's a big tradition of traditional healing in Ireland, and of course, so we don't really worry too much about this. So, because I don't know but again, really what I'm trying to say is a lot of this thing is also to do with a psychological thing, like the use of charms and things like that, herbs and chants and healing stones. And we had these women called fairy doctors. They were usually, people really believed in them. It's really quite incredible how much they believed in them, because in the olden days, of course, there were no doctors or so few. And people would go to these old women who often had very near-death experiences and recovered, and they were meant to have been in touch with the next world, and people believed in them, and they were often the eldest child, and they passed it on to the eldest daughter, this kind of idea. Okay, so, now one of the things that was very important in Ireland was the seventh son of a seventh son, and as it happens, one of my neighbours in Dublin was a seventh son of a seventh son. Now look, it's magical thinking, I've no doubt about that. But every day, cars of people would come along to see this man. And what was really interesting was that they would come with all kinds of illnesses. And sometimes they would make a mistake and they would knock on my door. And it was quite interesting because they would come into my office, they'd walk into my office, and they had a look on their face of complete expectation and belief in me. When I pointed out to them, I'm sorry, I'm only a psychologist, I'm not a faith healer, you see the face drop completely. So they run out quickly and ran next door into the faith healer. He did much better business than I did. I took months and months to help people. He just put the hand on the head and took the money, and But actually, the funny thing is that for people who really believe this, a lot of them got quite. They reported a lot of benefit, because many illnesses are psychosomatic. They're mind-caused. I want to mention another famous Irish man called Dr. Jack Gibson, who lived in a big old castle outside of Dublin. And he was a surgeon. And he became actually world famous because he didn't use anesthetics. He did all his operations entirely under hypnosis. And he amputated legs, opened up the hearts, he did all kinds of things. He was an amazing surgeon. And there were never any complaints about him. Maybe the patients died, I don't know. But anyway, he was a very successful surgeon. And he didn't believe in anesthetics because he thought they were dangerous and they had all kinds of side effects. So and because people knew he was such a good hypnotist, they would go to him. And they didn't have all the effects of the anesthesia. Nowadays, there are practically no surgeons who use hypnosis anymore. What's happening? Why is it that this was not just the science of medicine, it was the art of medicine, which is disappearing so much. And again, you got to understand the context in Ireland. This man lived in a big old castle. He belonged to the gentry. In Ireland, there were a lot of poor people and some very rich people, and he was from the very rich background, so he had an aura about him. He was a gentleman, and people would go there and they would do everything he was asked, and so it was the mental and the social connection that changed the way that they perceived him, and it worked. It really worked, and that's the important thing. Because nowadays, we're all so cynical about doctors, and doctors are cynical about us, so these things don't work so much anymore. Okay, maybe we should go to where I really should talk about. It is the mindfulness. Now, of course, mindfulness I'm not sure about Hungary, but in the English-speaking world, mindfulness has taken off. It's become quite global. When I was young, a long time ago, I did my PhD on mindfulness. At that time, nobody was interested. I remember finding it very difficult to find somebody to supervise my PhD because they thought it was a kind of Indian voodooism or strange stuff. They didn't. But anyway, I did it. And Now it's the opposite. Now everybody wants to do mindfulness. Is it the same here in Hungary? I don't know, maybe not. It's beginning, yeah. Well, it'll come. It's going everywhere. But of course, people think many people think it's American. Well, of course, it's not American. The Americans have used it. Sorry about that, but in fact, it comes from the East, and it started off actually. People think oh well, maybe it's Buddhist. Well, actually, no. It really comes out of Hinduism. It comes out of the yoga and the Vedic Upanishad tradition. Anybody who takes yoga seriously will know that everything they do, their breathing, their posture, their movements, their digestion, they have to do mindfully. Okay, it's about being in touch. Your mind being an observer of the self. Okay, so Buddhism took it over and began to develop it further. And so we know that in fact, the reason why we think it's Buddhist is because the Buddhists really developed mindfulness in a very big way. They took it further than the Buddhists did. We know it also exists in Taoism. We know it exists in Judaism, in the Kabbalah tradition. In Christianity, with the Desert Fathers and the Benedictines, these are monks. In Islam, especially Sufism. And then, of course, we have the Russians, like Gurdjieff, Uspensky. I'm not sure if people are familiar with these, but if you know these people, you know they're all into mindfulness. Of course, psychoanalysis itself is kind of a bit like that. I'm not sure if you have time, but if you imagine, I'm not sure how much you know about psychoanalysis, but the instructions that Freud gives to his patients is that they have to say whatever thing comes to their mind. They're not allowed to censor what comes into their minds. They have to have what he called choiceless awareness. That is, just speak everything as it appears. No, not to select anything and not to judge, just to speak it out. And the listener, the psychoanalyst, has also to focus on everything and not to select little bits and pieces. So both of them have to be quite mindful. In Gestalt therapy, there's a lot of mindfulness in the here and now, paying attention to the here and now, what's happening right now. So we know it's not just limited to either Hinduism or Buddhism. What is it about? Well, in meditation, meditation is stare in medio in Italian Latin. It's midstream, it's finding a balance. It's attention, being absorbed, completely focused and concentrated. But we can get that in natural settings. We don't have to do, it doesn't have to be a religion. We can look at seascapes and skyscapes and landscapes. We can look at the sight of them and the sound of them. The sound of the waterfalls, the raindrops on the roof, the wind in the leaves. We can look at candle flames, look at flowers. We can listen to sacred music and classical music. We can listen to birdsong. We can focus on our breath, on mantras and koans. Do you know what a koan is? Anybody here? No. Some people do, obviously. A koan is a kind of riddle. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? What did your face look like before you were born? The idea is to make you, in fact, is to stop you thinking logically, because there's no answer. There's no logical answer. And because there's no logical answer, the idea is to knock out your normal analytical thinking. Now we know that the mindfulness has spread into mindfulness-based stress reduction by John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy by John Teasdale and Mark Williams, and dialectical behavior therapy by Linehan, and acceptance and commitment therapy by Hayes. Now, you may know these, but if you don't worry. What I'm saying is now it's spreading all over the West in different forms and different schools of psychotherapy. And it's applied to stress now, it's applied to anxiety, to sleeplessness, depression relapse. Now, it's really quite interesting because with depression relapse, we know that a lot of interesting research shows that we can predict who is likely to become depressed, and we can predict who is likely to stay depressed. And the simple reason is it's a question of a rumination. Now, rumination is when you're thinking all the time about the same thing over and over again. It's a kind of obsession. And it's losing control of your mind. The mind begins to take over. And ruminating, actually, a cow ruminates as well, but it's eating grass over and over again. Rumination is also chewing on something over and over again. A cow has 7 stomachs, and the grass goes up and from a special bag into the stomach where it's ruminated, and then it goes. This happens over and over again. Now, rumination is the obsessive thinking, and when people begin to ruminate and they cannot stop it on negative things, the chances are they become depressed. It's one of the biggest predictor, and we know in fact that with mindfulness we can in fact when people are not depressed, we can then teach them to not stop rumination with cognitive behavior therapy, but to actually look at their ruminations mindfully and to take a distance from them, not to identify with these ruminating thoughts, to take a step back from them. So it works very well. We know now that we can prevent relapse back into depression by teaching people just to become mindful of their ruminations and not to identify with them, but just observe them and smile at them. Okay, we also know it can be used for eating disorders. The idea that you eat mindfully. You don't gulp your food down, you taste every morsel, every piece. You drink mindfully. So it's more like the quality rather than quantity. And you can teach people to be mindful in their eating disorders. By the way, I have to say about depression that you don't teach mindfulness to people who are completely depressed or who are psychotic. It just doesn't work. You have to wait till they're better. It works more as a prevention rather than a cure. Okay? Mindfulness is fine-tuning. It's not major therapy. It's delicate tuning. So once you are better, it helps you stay better. It's a bit like the analogy I make. When people become really, really depressed or psychotic, it's like they've gone into a pothole. And psychiatrists are very good at pulling you out of the pothole, but they're not very good at preventing you from falling back into one another time. And really, that's the work of psychology. It's the work of mindfulness and psychotherapy. It's to prevent you going back into the pothole. So with mindfulness, we wait till people are a bit better, and then we try to make sure they don't get ill again. That's really the way it works, more the way it works. With relationships, it's really interesting. I do a lot of work with relationships. I have a lot of couples coming into me, and I really like that work because they come in and they're really angry with each other, or one is accusing the other of something, and one person is very tense, being attacked, and the other person is doing all the talking, and the tension in the room and the body language is terrible. And then I observe them. I say, just talk to each other, and I tell them what the problem is, and I let them fight for a while, and then I say, no, okay, let's try a different approach, because what's happening here is that I can see you're attacking and retaliating and attacking again, and this is like a fight, and you're feeling offended, and you're feeling angry, and this is not helping. So what I say, okay, I want you now. We have John and Mary. I want you to talk for 10 minutes, and Mary, you listen to John, and John, you tell Mary what your problems are. And your job, Mary, is to listen mindfully. And after 10 minutes, you have to, in 1 minute, summarize what he was saying. Not to criticize it, not to accept it, not to reject it. Just tell John what you think he was saying to you. Listen very carefully. And then I said, John, do you think that Mary understood you? And if in fact she didn't, just tell her again what you really want to say, and you listen carefully, Mary. Then it's the other way around, okay? It's then the other way, and then in fact, Mary has to talk, and John has to really listen mindfully. So they don't interrupt each other. They don't get into a fight. They have to start listening mindfully and try to imagine what it is like to be the other person. What it's like to be Mary? What it's like to be John? How do I come across the other person? How does she come across to me or me to her? And so you get this idea of really careful, a real discussion, a real meeting of minds. A real meeting of minds, and not a battle. And they have to practice this. And it's incredible, because often they haven't been listening to each other, just been fighting. And so that's how it's used in couples work, relationship work. We know also from research, and I haven't got time to show all the research findings, but we know that mindfulness has a big impact on the immune system. We know that people, for everything from the common cold, even to the white blood cells, which the leukocytes, which fight disease, there's an improvement in the production of lymphocytes with the practice of mindfulness, but not just mindfulness, also some forms of relaxation and hypnosis. We know that it improves the defense system. And so you're better able to deal with even with people with HIV, with AIDS, they found that this helps. So there's a lot of research, scientific evidence of the benefits of mindfulness in a whole range of areas, especially with anxiety, with depression, with eating, relationships, and with immune disorders. Now, I'm not going to focus on the Hinduism because it's just too much there, but I just want the idea that for the Buddhists, the Buddhists think that we weren't born happy. If you look at the way their attitude is, that if you look at little children, they cry a lot, they are naturally narcissistic, in other words, they are obsessed with themselves. If they're hungry, they cry. If they're asleep, they want to go to bed, they cry. There are many things about children that they have to learn to become happy. And that's the Buddhist position, okay? That happiness is not something you're born with. You're born with the capacity to be happy, and we can all be happy, but it's a construction. It's something you have to learn to do. And they call that sukha. The idea that it's something. Now, of course, the word happiness is a difficult word because, you know, it's an English word, obviously, and it's in other languages there may be better words, like French would have like bien-être, well-being maybe, that kind of thing. So it's not going around being happy all the time, but it's a peacefulness or a lack of conflict within oneself. Oh yeah, I have the words here, bien-être or joie de vivre. It's not really. We're not talking about the happiness you get when you from drugs or even just from sex, or alcohol. It's a deeper kind. It's not pleasure, because pleasure, you can get pleasure from gambling. You can get pleasure from punching somebody in the face you don't like. That's pleasure, but it's not the same as. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a deeper sense of well-being. So the way according to the Buddhists, the way you do this is by intentionally, by internal transformation. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a bit different from the Freudian position, because Freud believed that in being aggressive, we often experience a kind of pleasure. Okay? That's why there's so much warfare and there's so much sadism. And that's why there's so many people are prepared to do pretty awful things. That he became quite pessimistic, Freud, because he saw that you know, people often like to go to warfare, they like to bully, they like to be in power. So he was much more pessimistic. He thought that the pleasure that people get from being aggressive is a real problem. And in fact, the Buddhists would tend to agree with that. So we're not just talking about pleasure. This is something deeper. It's a sense of well-being that respects yourself and respects other people. Now, Buddha, of course, also pointed out that life is full of suffering and full of unsatisfactoriness. We call that dukkha. Life is not satisfactory. Of course, he knew that. Of course, the Buddha was born a prince, and when he was born, his mother died. She died giving birth to him. And when his son was born, he left the palace. Now, it's really quite interesting from a psychodynamic point of view. He abandoned his son like his mother abandoned him in death. Okay, he left. Now, he had a great life in the palace. He had his wife, and he had all these other mistresses, and he had all the food. He could do what he wanted. He was at the top of the social range. But he went out and he saw all the suffering around the place. He saw illness, he saw death, he saw poverty, he saw misery, and he began to think, I think personally, if this is all true, because this is all written, of course, after he died, that he was quite depressed himself. That's how I see it. And he actually deliberately starved himself. He treated himself very harshly. He thought that through suffering, he would become enlightened. So he did all the terrible things. He deprived himself of all the good things of life, the comforts of his home, the good food, the women, whatever. He deprived himself, and he became more and more thin and more miserable. And then he decided this was not going to make him enlightened after all. So he had tried all the luxury of the palace and tried the misery of the back streets. And then he thought, it's the middle path. It's the middle path. It's not the extremes. It's the middle we have to go for. So he said, look, there are two main reasons why we suffer, dukkha, craving and aversion. We either try to hold on to the things we like. We try to possess and hold on to them, and we try to control them and grab onto them, be it partners, be it money, be it prestige, be it your reputation, be it property, be it whatever. We crave of food, sex, drugs, or we have aversion. That is, we reject certain types of food, certain types of people, certain ideas, maybe the opposite sex, whatever. We have aversions to certain things. We reject certain things. And he thought, these are the big problems. This kind of grabbing and pushing away. Because you have to stay in the middle. You have to experience everything. So he said, look, the way to end all this suffering is the Eightfold Path, or middle path. Now, this is the basic middle path. And, it's, again, a translation into English from what was really written either in Sanskrit or Pali. These are the languages of India and Nepal. And but if you can try to understand what I'm getting at, or what he was getting at, I didn't write this, that you have to try to understand what's happening in the world around you. And it's the way you think about things. Now, of course, so watch the way you think, watch the way you speak, what you do, the way you act. Are you, how you act in this world, including livelihood. For example, he believed that certain forms of livelihood were not acceptable. So he didn't believe in being a soldier, warfare, for example. He thought certain things were immoral. The effort you have to make an effort, and you must learn to concentrate and become mindful. Now that's really, it's a whole journey to mindfulness. Now, of course, nowadays, in the quick packages of these mindfulness courses, they focus very much on the last one, right mindfulness. But of course, for him, and this is important, for the Buddha, it was a whole ethical development. It wasn't just simply being mindful so that you could make more money, or that you could sell your goods more efficiently. We know that mindfulness, of course, can be used in many contexts where really it could be seen to be unethical. It's a bit like, the work we did with, I'm not sure if anybody's ever worked with in prisons with psychopaths, but I have, what we found was that indeed many of the prisoners could be helped with psychotherapy. Many really could be helped, but some of them, the more they learned about psychology, the better, the more efficient psychopaths they became. In other words, they used the understanding not to help other people, but to exploit other people more efficiently. So there is what you do with knowledge has to be ethical. I mean, and that is the Buddha's message, that it has to be ethical. It's not just a question of knowing more and understanding more, but also a question of what you do with that knowledge. We know, for example, that a lot of interesting research on psychopaths. We know that they are very good at reading of a good psychopath, as opposed to, a very primitive psychopath just uses violence. But a clever psychopath gets usually quite far in an institution because they're very good at reading people in order how to manipulate them and how to exploit them. So their knowledge is not so much to help people, but to help themselves. So one of the issues then, of course, central to the whole Buddhist idea is to be able to let go. Let go of your baggage. Let go of all the stuff, all the anger, all the rage, all the revenge. Because all of us have been hurt by somebody, or our parents have been hurt, our ancestors have been hurt. There's so much hurt being caused by warfare and in our personal lives that we carry all this with us. Revenge and getting even and all of that is there. And we know it's a central part of Buddhism and also Confucianism and also in the Jewish tradition of Yom Kippur and of course in Christianity. So this idea of letting go. What the Buddha's meant to have said, because of course this was all written down after he died, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Well, that's of course Confucius said, before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. In other words, your own as well. And Oscar Wilde, I'm not sure how many of you know Oscar Wilde, but he was a famous Irish writer. He's very, if you know him, you know him. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. That idea and of course, we know that in the Mayo Clinic in the States, the research on forgiveness, letting go of all this anger and stuff. We know that our self-esteem goes up when we can let that stuff go. Our immune response improves. Our cardiac function improves. This is research. I don't want to go into too much detail, but our blood pressure improves, our mood, anxiety, etc. In other words, letting go is not only good for society, but it's also good for yourself, which is great. Any questions or anything not clear? To carry on, so. Okay, so back to the middle path. Of course, Buddha was not his name. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, because Buddha means the enlightened one, just like Christ means the Savior. So, Christ is not a name, neither is Buddha a name, it's a title. So Buddha, of course, he lived before, about half a millennium before the Christian era. And he believed very much in the middle path. So did Confucius. So if you think about 2,500 years ago, you had all these people writing or speaking around this idea of moderation. Already then, he talked to the Confucius, the doctrine of the mean, mental balance and harmony. Aristotle, in Greece, ancient Greece, around the same time, a little bit later perhaps, the middle path between extremes yields virtues. For example, courage as opposed to recklessness or cowardice. Now, if you can be reckless, or you can be cowardly, and instead you have to show courage. So courage is the middle, is the dialectic, if you like. You have one hand, you have the reckless behavior, or you have cowardly behavior, but maybe in the middle is the resolution is courage. It's a kind of a golden mean in the Greek idea, these beauty and truth. So what did Buddha think? I mean, Buddha's work is very interesting for psychologists because he believed that there were 3 sources of suffering. First of all, ignorance, and really ignorance. I have to come back to this again and again. That when we're suffering, there's often something that we don't know that we need to learn. Not always. I mean, you could be knocked down by a car, and but maybe you weren't looking properly or something. But never mind. But a lot of suffering is from ignorance. And of course, the other is rejection, aversion, and the other is the craving I talked about. And we'll come back to these again. So what do we crave for, according to Buddha? Well, we, of course, crave for sensory gratification, the id, what Freud would call the id. All our pleasures, food, drink, sex, power, those kind of basic things. But we also crave for survival, the denial of death, eros. Like we don't like the idea of dying. Most of us don't like. However, there are other people, and they definitely exist, actually they crave for annihilation, for thanatos, the denial of life. Now, I worked for a long time in a section of psychiatry called, what do you call it? Yeah, treatment-resistant depression. These are people who were very depressed and nothing helped them. And a lot of them were determined to kill themselves. In fact, the suicide rate was very high. This was a place where people went where they were so depressed that you really you could do nothing for them anymore. They didn't respond to medication, they didn't respond to electroconvulsive therapy, nothing seemed to help, okay? And they were obsessed with dying. In fact, you had to constantly watch them, and because, of course, in this age of litigation, when a patient commits suicide, somebody gets blamed. We get blamed. You're constantly worried that it'll be your fault. The responsibility becomes yours, not the patient's anymore. The society says now it's your fault because you're meant to stop him or her killing himself or herself. And it's very difficult for the staff. It's very, very difficult because this is actually a real possibility. And these people are completely caught up in this denial of life, this desire to be dead. And the reason they often give, if you talk to them and ask them, is because they see death as a return, as Freud said actually, as a return to a pre-birth stage. A peaceful stage where there's no more demands, no more suffering, no more worries, no more conflicts. And if they could revert back to the stage they were before they were born, everything would be fine again. In other words, they didn't want to be born. Well, that's what they say. Of course, when you work with them, you find out it's not as simple as that, and many, in fact, can learn to want to live again. Most do. Now, the other thing is the way we cling on to things. Attachment and loss are two sides of the same coin. We attach ourselves in clinging, grasping, and identificatory ways. We identify with things. We attach to people, obviously, to objects, ideas, ideologies, identities, and we become quite dogmatic about them. In fact, we're prepared to kill for them. A lot of people have been killed because of their political ideas, because of their religious ideas, or just because who they're born into, what kind of food they eat, whatever. But people get really, and of course in Ireland, we lived for 30 years with really every day on the radio there'd be somebody being killed. It got really bad, and you can see it happening, and you can see the revenge and the cycles of revenge, and you can see the paranoia. And people would know, they very quickly work out what religion you are. Are you Catholic, are you Protestant, or what are you? And they'd be trying to work out from your name, your appearance. And it was a terrible atmosphere, all around, and but so there was a joke going around Dublin. A gunman finds him and asks the person, "Are you Catholic or a Protestant?" And the guy says, "I'm a Jew." "Are you a Catholic Jew or a Protestant Jew?" So it wasn't. There's no escape. You have to be in one. You have to be in one. You're on one side or the other. So life is a series of gains and losses. We gain the womb. We gain the breast. We gain being born, but we also have to be weaned. We have to lose the breast. We have to lose the womb. We have to go to school. We have to leave school. Life is a series of gains and losses. Nothing is permanent, and that's called anika in Sanskrit. Even the self is changing all the time, and we die. That's anatta. A in Sanskrit is the same as a in Greek. I'm not sure how many of you do Greek, but a means is without or no. None. So life is a process of identifications. We all have to identify. We all have to be narcissistic when we grow up. It's called primary narcissism. We have to look at. We have to thrive. We have to eat. We have to belong. We have to belong to a group just to get by. But then we have to also learn to go beyond that, to leave that, and go into a bigger world. So I'm not sure if you know the work of Roberto Assagioli. He had a form of psychotherapy called psychosynthesis, an Italian psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. So the idea that you neither grasp nor reject experience, you learn to become a neutral observer. We also need to learn to see experience afresh as novel, trying not to keep your prejudices. So all identifications open up new possibilities, but also limit us. They should be transitional. In other words, when I identify, when I want to study, for example, if I wanted to study, say, cognitive behavior therapy, it opens something up in me, or psychology, but it can also limit me, because there's also philosophy, there's also anthropology, there's also genetics. When I become a psychoanalyst, then that can also open up new possibilities, but it can also limit me, because there are many other ways of looking at the world. So everything new opens up, but if you stop there, then you can, and reject the rest, then that can be limiting. So personal self moves beyond into the transpersonal. Now, I'm not sure how long you want me to talk for. Okay, I can talk a bit longer, but we'd start a bit late. Yeah? Okay. Now, for Buddha, what was really critical was that we're social beings. This is really, it's not about just you being happy in a bubble, happy in your own little bubble. It's about you being part of a bigger social network, interdependence. He really stressed that. It's not about them versus us dichotomy. It's about justice. If you're feeling in a bad mood and want to be critical, well, the best person to be critical of is yourself as a good start. In other words, look at yourself first. And as Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about other people can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Don't worry about the other ones, but the idea that when we are critical of other people, we, in fact, it may be something we need to look at ourselves. That it's something about us that's the problem. Now, when I said the last two ideas, the idea that we all have problems. None of us are sane. That's the idea, okay? In fact, this man called Bolas, he had made a joke. He said, you know, people who are too normal, we call them normotics. They're not psychotics, but they're normotics. The idea that they're so normal that it can't be true. We all have problems. So there's also a lot of research showing that altruism, I hope you know what I mean by altruism, but that concern for other people and being kind to other people, that people, we know, in fact, what the research shows again and again, that people who are caring about other people, who are less egocentric, less narcissistic, are happier people. There's a lot of research for this. I'm not sure if you read the book, anybody, you know the book by Mathieu Ricard, does anybody know? It's a fantastic book called Happiness. It's all the research. It's written in French originally, and now it's an English translation. He was a geneticist as well originally, who became a Buddhist and psychotherapist. He did a lot of research on happiness, and he found that he looked at the kind of work that people who are obsessed with themselves, who are self-focused, they limit themselves, really, really limit themselves to enjoying the bigger world. Like compassion and loving kindness is also good for yourself. Interbeing versus egocentrism. A kind of connected mindfulness in space and in time. Now, what they mean by that is that in the Buddhist tradition, you have to respect the people who live around you, that's in space, but also the people who came before. Well, that is very much in their sort of Chinese way of thinking. Ancestor worship will be important there. Again, that's a whole topic I want to go into. Now, okay, I want to just talk a little bit about suffering and the importance of not wasting your suffering. There are many people who believe that it's important to transform suffering into knowledge, into self-understanding, not to waste. People like Nietzsche would talk about that too, of course. A lot of German philosophers and French philosophers, but also, of course, the Buddhists and the psychoanalysts too. The idea that suffering can tell you something about your own limitations, and that suffering is an opportunity for self-expansion and self-improvement. Do you want me to stop there? Because I'm now going into a different topic, which is going into actual how meditation works, or I'm not sure, because we did start a bit late, but I'm happy to.
We did finish a bit late as well. I prefer to ask our audience if you have any questions, comments, or anyone is interested in how meditation works. Can we do it?
As usual, we get a mixture. Some say yes, some say no. So I don't mind really. I can talk, or I can have a conversation with you, or I can just talk into the air. You know, I have some time left.
Okay, then please go on with
a little bit more. Okay, basically, and I try to keep this simple because I don't have to read all of this. But there are two types of meditation: narrowly focused and wide angle. The narrowly focused is called concentration, and the wide angle is what we call mindfulness. Okay, so. But you have to learn the focus first of all. You have to learn the concentration first of all. Because if you can't concentrate your mind is like it's going all over the place. It's hopping here and hopping there. And so the training in meditation is learning to focus your attention. Okay, it could be your posture, your breath, what you see, what you hear, what you taste, what your feelings are, what your thoughts are. You learn to observe and concentrate on these things. So you constrict and you narrowly focus your attention. So it could be a candle flame or a mantra, but you learn initially, the best way to start is to start in a natural way. Learn to listen to birdsong. Really look at the sky. Really look, when you're walking around in the country or even in the town of Budapest, look at things and focus. Don't be too quick. Spend time really looking deeply, or listening deeply, or smelling or tasting deeply. Now that is the concentration. Then of course you can go more abstract. You can concentrate on a mantra or an idea like love, whatever. But you focus. When you're very good at concentrating, and that's called concentrative meditation, you can then move on to the it's mental. It's called samatha, by the way. It's called samatha, and it's meant you end up being very tranquil and silent, and in some ways you let go of your mind, because if you repeat a mantra over and over again, after a while your brain is saying there's nothing new coming in here, and the brain gets bored with the mantra. Okay, and if you're in a good place, your mind really quietens down because there's nothing to think about. If you're in a bad place, all kind of worries and anxieties can erupt. But if you're lucky, you'll have samatha. Now, vipassana is the opposite. Vipassana is for people who are properly trained in concentration, who learned to dilate, to open up and have a wide-angle focus, and they learn to be mindful of everything simultaneously. That's much more difficult to do, in fact, where you don't reject anything. You just let every experience come into your awareness. So in concentration, it's called one-pointedness. You get relaxation, you get stimulus monotony and a reduced input. You get the stimulus habituates. I hope you understand these words. If you're lucky, you have no thought. It's called deep absorption or flow. Or the following may happen. Because you're blocking your cognitive or secondary process construing or thinking, you get a reversion to the preverbal and somatic, or what we call primary process constraint takes place. Now, don't worry about those words, secondary process and primary process. They're Freudian concepts. Basically, is that if you're stopping yourself thinking in a logical way, your body will instead revert to something more primitive. That is the preverbal, the bodily, the emotions, the pains here, the tension there, and tensions and that kind of thing. Because your psychological defenses are weakened by repeating a mantra, you might get what we call a kind of abreaction coming out. And that can be very good. I also use meditation, not only to induce hypnosis, but also to get people to begin to open up and talk about what was their problems and what's worrying them. I could go on this. I can get deeper and deeper into this, but I'm not sure how much you want me to go into it, because it gets okay. But on this concentration, see, it's the silence that's so important. I want to stress to you that we know there's a lot of research showing the benefits of silence. A lot of research. People learn better in silent situations. They relax more. People living in cities with a constant, we're so little used to being in silence. Luckily, I'm sure it's the same here in Hungary. I don't know. I haven't been here very often, but I know in parts of Ireland, you can be somewhere where there's nobody. You completely, and Scotland also, there's nobody around. You have complete silence. All you hear is birds, and you might hear the wind, and it's very, very relaxing. It's very different from walking around a city. Walking in a city, you have constant noise, and noise actually agitates us. It agitates us. Whereas being in total silence can be very restful. Very restful for some people, but other people hate silence. And they hate silence because they're afraid of themselves. Very disturbed people like to be distracted from themselves. They can't be in silence. Being in silence is scary and frightening because they have to pay attention to all their bodily emotions and their tensions and the conflicts. So it's silence, though. If it goes well, it leads to an emptiness, a laying fallow. You know what the word fallow means? Fallow is when a field is not used for agriculture anymore. It's just lying, a field that's left just to lie. And of course, in that empty space, something new can form. A new concept. You become more receptive. So you give birth to a new idea, to a new insight, a new intuition. So we call this the intuitive self develops. And it's not about communication, it's more about feeling in communion. Now these are getting big words, but communion means being linked. Linked maybe to other people, to the world around you, the world inside you. And you might experience some sort of timelessness and eternity, or beginninglessness, or endlessness, and formlessness. Now what I mean by that is that in the Buddhist tradition, there's no beginning and no end. And there's also the Hindu. Life is a circle. We go around and around and around, but it's a circle. So there's eternity. Performance. We are all, as we are born, we learn to perform more and more. We learn to have form. We learn to speak a language. We learn to dress a certain way, how to eat a certain way. We don't eat like pigs anymore. So we learn to be polite. We take form. We learn a certain cultural norms. And we learn to perform like I'm performing now. I'm giving a talk. But we learn all these things. We're always performing in some kind of way. But the idea is that sometimes it's nice just to let go of all of that, to let go of all form, and just to completely go back to this very simple way, just being. Any questions? Because I could go on and on and on. 2 more hours. I don't mind.
So, Eva has a question. Well, what do you think? What is the relationship between flow, the concept of flow, and this Buddhism concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the flow concept, I can never pronounce his name. It's very complicated, the man who came up with the idea. But don't embarrass me, because I know you're talking about. But for me, it's such a difficult name to pronounce.
It's Hungarian.
But I'm maybe sure you're probably better at this. But the idea of flow, of course, is very similar to what they're talking about, because it's not having any resistance to what's coming your way. It's like letting go, but you have to be very confident of yourself. If you're asking somebody who's very suicidal or very depressed or psychotic to go with the flow, they could jump out the window. It's not necessarily, or a very angry person, he could punish you, he could attack you. That's going with the flow as well. So I haven't had time to get to this because up to now you think I'm idolizing all of this. I'm not an idealist at all. In fact, I think there can be great dangers to some of these things, and I haven't got to that part of the talk yet. That for vulnerable people, going with the flow isn't a good idea. For vulnerable people, meditation can be quite dangerous. And I need to say that because, you know, I worked in a psychiatric context, and, you know, when young and idealistic, you're trying to teach everybody, and then you realize, woo, this is not necessarily a good idea. So, you know, I see it as a fine-tuning that comes after, say, psychotherapy. You know, so I'm not sure I've answered your question, but they do. It's the idea that if you are in a good place, you don't have to put any form, any structure, you just go with the flow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your deep, impressive presentation. Now I think we all have some ideas what mindfulness is or could be. It was not clear for me if you have stopped with your presentation, so it was some kind of a mindfulness in a different way. But the next two questions are, which for me are very important, is how can one learn mindfulness personally? How can I learn mindfulness? And of course, how can I teach mindfulness to other people, to patients? And with this respect, the consciousness discipline to play a very big role, especially meditation techniques, self-hypnosis and so on. So from your practice, when you try to teach a kind of mindfulness to your patients, do you use the different consciousness disciplines, and what types do you use?
Okay, to teach mindfulness, yeah. Okay, well that's actually, I think that is the next slide really. I skipped a slide, but okay. I don't worry about all these different terms which are basically from Sanskrit. But first of all, mindfulness is about being in the here and now, the hic and nunc in Latin. It's about what we call de-automatization. That is that you stop trying to be automatic the way you normally are. It's a kind of choices awareness that you try to become aware of everything rather than choosing what you want to be aware of. So it's the opposite of focusing. And it's kind of bare witnessing where you are not judgmental. So you stop giving out about yourself or about other people. You just experience what's happening. Just look at it. So you, for example, the body scan is the first thing. You look at your posture, your tension, the way you walk, breathe, stand. These are simple things that you practice. When you're doing the washing, cooking, again, you do it mindfully. You look at your thoughts, your feelings, your imagery. But you also move on between self-awareness into social awareness. You begin to observe other people. And you develop a kind of witness consciousness, it's called. Okay, now that's a very quick summary. And of course, it's the only way I can really teach you mindfulness is to do it with you.
To the microphone, please.
To do it. Can you hear me? No. In other words, teaching mindfulness is not something you have to read. You have to actually practice. Now, I'm quite happy to do that, but that would be a different kind of situation. You probably have to get you all to relax and sit in a circle. But I could do it for you. That would be the best way. If you want. I'm not sure how, or just talking about is something else, but how many of you are familiar with mindfulness? Have done it, practice? Oh, well, sure, I don't have to teach you. Half of you anyway, so, yeah. So that's okay.
Does someone have a question to Michael? Yes, please.
I have a question that you mentioned that meditation works as emerging primary process, and I have a question about it. That Lama Aula told us that meditation starts where therapy ends. So he quotes that only people with a rather healthy mind is able to meditate, or like if somebody starts it, maybe with a diagnosis of bipolar or borderline diagnosis, then in this process, where the primary process starts, he will experience really horrible feelings. So, as you mentioned, that when somebody is just sitting alone and his deep problems can emerge in a state of meditation. So I'm just interested whether if you understand with Lama Aula that meditation works only if you are healthy or closer to healthy then.
Thank you.
So it's my question.
You can ask me if I'm not clear to come back to me because, of course, there's a problem with what I said because nobody is completely healthy. Okay, so that to say that you have to, when I said that it's best to do psychotherapy first and then do meditation and then do mindfulness, I'm generalizing, and I just give you a good example. Yeah, you mentioned bipolar. Okay, I would see many people who are bipolar, and they come to me because usually they have conflicts with themselves and their surroundings. At work, there may be complaints about them because when they were high, they were saying things and doing things that were upsetting their colleagues. So a good example of a dentist who came to me, he was getting into trouble at work because when he was high, he would behave inappropriately with the staffs, and the nurses and the secretaries were giving out about him. So, and his wife was giving out him. So he had, first of all, to be stabilized with medication. Then with the psychotherapy, he could see that, in fact, many of his problems went right back to his childhood. And then he became interested, the next stage, he became interested to say, well, maybe I don't need so much medication, but I must learn to take some control over my own destiny, my own thoughts, and my own behaviors. And he actually became very interested in mindfulness. So then I began to work with the mindfulness side, and that worked very well for him. So it wasn't just straight into mindfulness. It was first medication, then psychotherapy, and then finally mindfulness, and also for him, very helpfully, a kind of philosophy. He liked to do a bit of philosophy, and he really changed that way. It was a long journey. It took years. It wasn't a quick fix, and I have to say that because I worry about people who have serious challenges like manic depressive bipolar disorder. It can be very difficult for them. But it's a possible journey. It really is a possible journey. And, but, you see, the real problem, I think, today is that we just don't give... I think the big problem in modern medicine is we don't give people the time they need to heal. We're all in a hurry, it costs too much money, time is money, and a lot of psychiatry is shortcut. It's, when you work in a psychiatric hospital, you've got so many suffering people, and the psychiatrists can't cope, and medication keeps them quiet and helps that way, and it's a good first step, but it's really not enough. It's not enough. And but everything in medicine, and especially in psychiatry, and also in general practice, it's because we have too many patients and we have not enough time, and we don't give the patients the time to find alternatives. And there are many alternatives: healthy lifestyle, a healthy diet, good hobbies, good social connections, and things like mindfulness, or etc.
Okay, we have to stop now.
Yeah, we have to stop.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, according to our time schedule, unfortunately, we have to stop now. I want to thank Michael DelMonte for his nice presentation, his insights to mindfulness. Thank you very much.